welcome everybody to the East Midlands HR Network. We're really pleased to be running the event this morning, and I'll explain a bit about the plan for this morning. We're aiming for probably about an hour and a half together, and as I say, we haven't run one of these online for a little while, so we're glad that people were able to join us. Just as a reminder, we've got a number of people who are familiar with the network, some that may have joined us for the first time. We started the network, I think, about 7, 8 years ago, maybe even longer than that. And it was 3 organisations. So Actons, which is where I'm head of employment, Bjorn at Blue Source, who will speak towards the end and give us a bit of an update on what's coming next, and then Penny Strutton, who runs a consultancy called Think Forward. And we got HR people together, and it kind of took off, running events, roundtables, and larger events. And it's great to get online and see so many of you. So keep an eye out for future events. But for this morning, we're really excited to welcome Annie Walton, who's the centre head at Maggie's in Nottingham. And I'm sure a lot of you will know about the great work that Maggie's do locally. And if you don't, you're about to find out about more of it. But we're really pleased to have Annie along to share some sort of guidance and expertise and insight for employers in terms of how to manage people well who are suffering with cancer. It's clearly an issue that affects lots of us in our lives, be it personally or with family, but also it's something that we have to be alive to as employers. So we're really excited about this morning having Annie along. Annie's going to kick us off and talk us through some of the work that the centre does, and help us with some of that. I've got then a short section at the end where I'm just going to talk about this from a sort of legal perspective, but that's kind of a tag on to the end, and hopefully that's useful as well. But for now, I'll hand over to Annie, and she will welcome everybody.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Hi, I'm Annie, and I'm the centre head here at Nottingham. I've been here for 5 years now, and I previously came from Nottingham University Hospitals Trust, where I worked in acute oncology for about 26 years. So, as I say, I've been here 5 years now. Okay. So this is normally obviously done in a classroom base where we have quite a lot of interaction. So the same rules don't really apply here. So hopefully I wouldn't hear your mobile phone if it went off anyway. So we're just going to go to a short video.
Hello and welcome to Maggie's Nottingham. I'm Annie, the centre head. Every day in this building we support people with cancer, their friends and family through the challenges that cancer brings. Our busy centre is a welcoming space to talk through whatever you're facing. Within our team, we have very skilled healthcare professionals who have all worked in oncology or psychology for many years. You can talk to one of our cancer support specialists, speak to an experienced psychologist, or find out more about the financial and practical support available to you with our benefits advisors.
I found out in January there is Maggie's. And without it, I would have been in a far worse place because I didn't know where else to turn. There's no one else to speak to. So to be here and to be able to have a relationship with various people going through various cancers, it brings a little bit of normality to it. Because it doesn't just affect your cancer, it can affect you mentally. That's why this place was brilliant.
At Maggie's, you're in a building with people who are all going through something similar. We're located in the grounds of the hospital and our doors are always open, 9 till 5, Monday to Friday. You don't need to make an appointment, just come in. Or if it's easier, give us a call or contact us via our Maggie's Nottingham page on our website.
Okay. So like the video said, we're situated in the grounds of the City Hospital. We're right next to the Breast Institute. For anybody that's ever been to the City campus, we're just off Gate 3 where Nottingham High Playing Fields are. and we're situated in what people say a funny green building. That's normally how people describe where we're at. Right, sorry about that. Okay, so cancer challenges in the workplace, which is obviously you're all here to hear about that. Okay, so an estimated 3 million people with cancer in the UK currently. That's probably already risen to 3.5 million. Before I ever do one of these sessions, I always go on the Office of National Statistics. It still hasn't been updated since 2007. I think it gets updated in line with the census. So I should imagine that will be coming out this year, because I think it's done every 5 years. But interestingly enough, the census in 2021 just updates the 2017 information. So I don't really know why that's not been updated. Probably COVID has set that back. So as you can see, an awful lot of people diagnosed each year, but survival rates have doubled. It says in the last 40 years, they will have doubled again in the last 10 years. 4 million people with cancer in the UK currently. It says by 2030, but there absolutely is that many people at the moment. And 1 in 3 people with cancer currently of working age, which I think is a little, even the most shocking statistic. Currently over 700,000 people with cancer in the workforce, 63,000 further who want to work, and 1.1 million people with cancer in the workforce by 2030. You're probably quite shocked that only 63,000 further who want to work or can, you know, but we see people coming through the centre every day. And I hear the most terrible stories about workplaces that I never thought that I would hear before I came here. I've obviously had a very privileged working life. I've worked for the NHS. I don't know whether everybody in the NHS would say that, but I consider it to be very privileged. It's very institutionalised. It pays very good sick pay. It has a good pension. If I got cancer tomorrow and I was in the NHS, I would be looked after for a whole 12 months. Not many people can say that, unfortunately, and not many people command a type of salary where they can put a significant bit of money away every month. And maybe even those of us who do will probably spend over our means and are probably maxed out on several credit cards. Maybe the more you earn, the more you spend. I don't know what the statistics are on that. But what I do know is that when you're on a Friday morning, you're told that unfortunately you have a brain tumour and you're a scaffolder, then your working life is completely over. You will never, ever go back up on a ladder. And on Monday morning, because the company will not pay you sick pay, they maybe give you 1 day or 2 days, you will go straight on to statutory sick pay, which I think currently is about £93 a week, which isn't an awful lot to support maybe 3 small children on, and maybe a wife who stays at home and looks after her children. So role of work, I know that we all wake up in the morning and sometimes think, oh, it would be so lovely to spend a week in bed reading my book or catching up on Netflix or Apple TV. But actually, you have a very different view of that if actually your role of work is taken away from you and you have enforced sick leave. Work gives us a huge focus. Outside of cancer, it gives us that sense of normality. It gives us routine. It gives us security. It forces us out of bed in the morning. It improves our social life, our self-esteem, and it's protective against low self-worth and depression. And there's loads of research and statistics out there to say that if you're in work, it really does support your mental health. So physical and psychological impact of cancer. So there are so many treatments out there today. Surgery, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, hormone therapies, targeted therapies, and they are used in a variety of different ways. And no one patient will go through exactly the same pathway. Now, you've probably heard of the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which decides on which pathway certain patients should follow, or which drugs are available to certain tumour sites, of which obviously there are many, and they estimate that at least 10 new drugs are going through the National Institute of Clinical Excellence every month and being approved. So there's an absolute raft of available treatments out there at the moment. Just to give you an example, I run a very large secondary breast cancer group, and those are ladies who have been diagnosed with a primary and unfortunately have gone on to develop a secondary breast cancer. And at that point, they become non-curative, but they don't become non-treatable. They can live with for many years with a secondary breast cancer, but they will always be having treatment. That will never finish. There's no light at the end of the tunnel for these ladies at all. And we have many people living with an ongoing cancer now, because for some of these really poor prognostic tumour sites that would have spread to a secondary, these people generally were living 6 to 18 months. That has completely changed now. Cancer has been reclassified as a chronic illness. And so people are living a lot longer, and people are choosing to continue to work while going through and continuing with their cancer treatment. So please, when you're dealing with a colleague or an employee, please don't assume just because Brenda down the road had treatment for a primary breast cancer and she was back at work within 6 months, or maybe stayed at work completely and only had surgery. Please don't assume that everybody will be going through the same treatment. Some ladies are going through 2.5 years of treatment for a primary breast cancer and then have hormone treatment. The rules and the pathways have changed enormously depending on the type of tumour you have in that tumour site. We now have immunotherapy, if anybody has ever heard of that. So common side effects. And these generally affect everybody. Okay, so obviously hair loss is a big one, but we have to remember that not all anti-cancer treatments will make your hair fall out. So don't assume that people are not having treatment if they keep their hair. We have lots of people coming in saying that their bosses or their workplace have actually been doubting them because they've not lost their hair. So a lot of chemotherapy doesn't make you lose your hair. It's only what we call platinum type chemos. Fatigue is a huge problem. It's very sensitive, this, sorry. Fatigue is a huge problem, and most people will develop chronic fatigue. I think it's probably about 85% of all patients going through any sort of cancer treatment will develop fatigue. If you think that radiotherapy and chemotherapy affects rapidly dividing cells, the body has to work so hard to replicate and in terms of healing and moving forward. Radiotherapy, for example, every time you go for a radiotherapy session, you're burning 800 calories. That's a huge amount of calories. Increased risk of infection. This obviously makes people more at risk of developing an infection if they are surrounded by people, small children, crowded place. We always say to people, please don't go to a Nottingham Forest football game or busy trams or Motorpoint Arena. But in actual fact, in reality, you only need one small child with a snotty nose and a heavy cold in the same room as you. And if you have a very low white cell count, then the chances of you picking that up are very high. Anemia, as I said, it affects all your rapidly dividing cells, and those include your red cells. And so you are more likely to have a low red cell count, which means that brings a whole other load of problems. I'm sure you've all heard of anemia, but obviously the red cell carries oxygen around the body, so it can cause shortness of breath. Nausea is a really common problem with chemotherapy. We obviously give lots of anti-sickness medication, but obviously that doesn't work for everybody, and that can be very debilitating. And hot flushes. Obviously, people going through chemotherapy, unfortunately, do go through the menopause, especially the gynae, the breast ladies, and the prostate men. So rarest side effects for all of these anti-cancer treatments are obviously skin changes, and that can be anything from a few spots, sore skin, to a complete outbreak where you're, losing skin layers, and it becomes very sore, and obviously then you start to get infected. Gastrointestinal, ongoing diarrhea, or constipation, but more likely diarrhea, and certainly for people who are having ongoing treatment. So for example, some of the tumour sites are using, well, all the tumour sites now are using immunotherapy in certain cases. So for example, if you had maybe a lung cancer, which we are now seeing quite a lot of post-treatment curative intent lung cancers, they are having ongoing immunotherapy, maybe up for two years, which can cause ongoing diarrhea, which is a huge problem for these people. Pain. We like to think that we can try and get on top of pain, but obviously in some cases, people just can't get on top of their pain, and even the consultants are unable. The palliative care team, which we use for complex symptom control, also really struggle. But in the majority of cases, pain is not an issue for most. Sore mouth or gums. I think this is probably more common than people realise. Obviously, as I said, the chemotherapy affects your rapidly dividing cells, so it basically just sheds all the mucosa. So that's all your soft bits on your tongue and the inside of your mouth, down your esophagus. So if you think about if ever you've had a mouth ulcer and you've been thinking that you have felt like dying because you've just got one mouth ulcer on the inside of your lip. I've had one and it's enormously painful and you moan all the time about it. These people have got 10 to 12 ulcers in their mouth, and eating and drinking becomes a real problem, and keeping your mouth clean, brushing your teeth becomes a huge problem. And in some circumstances, people have to take morphine even to be able to have a drink. The pain is so bad. And obviously reaction to treatment, even though it's rare, it does happen, which obviously means that they can't have any further cycles of the current treatment they're on, and then they have to start thinking and move them to something else. And obviously vomiting. I think it's changed a lot since I started in oncology. We would see a lot of patients that would just have this ongoing acute vomiting whilst having chemotherapy, and would end up being admitted to hospital for 5 or 6 days or more because obviously dehydration crept up, and then became quite difficult to treat at times. But anti-sickness drugs have changed enormously. So as I said, ongoing treatment, even for people with a curative disease, can be ongoing. Hormone therapies. Any lady having breast cancer will have at least 5, possibly 10 years of ongoing hormone treatment. Prostate men will maybe be on hormone treatment for the same amount of time. Some of the treatments will require a maintenance dose, especially hematological conditions. For those of you who've heard of things like lymphoma, leukemia, those sorts of conditions where it's affecting your bone marrow. Immunotherapies licensed to give for up to 2 years. These are drugs that help our body develop an immunoresponse and fight the cancer, slightly different from chemotherapy. And ongoing clinical trials where actually Nottingham might not be offering the same clinical trials as a Christie in Manchester, and vice versa. So people are tending to maybe go all over the country having clinical trials. And living with late effects. So here at Maggie's, in the last couple of years, we have built up a really good relationship with the late effects team in the trust. So anybody having a head and neck cancer and gynecological cancer have radiotherapy to their bowel, which may cause ongoing radiation late effects. We see a lot of those patients now within the Maggie Centre. These are late effects that actually people have to live with, and we help them, support them in living with their late effects. But I think previously, and I say to a degree now, you know, the National Health Service is very, very good at the front end. You know, we're very good at treating, but unfortunately, the NHS don't have the resources at the back end, and that's where we come in. And I think people just maybe feel that that's their lot, that actually they should be really grateful that maybe they have no signs or evidence of any cancer, and actually they just have to live with their late effects. But that's you know, that's not the case for us. We try to support them. So talking about temporary cognitive problems, for those of you who read the Times, there have been some really large articles in there in the last 18 months about cognitive problems for cancer patients having treatment. They estimate that I think it's about, well, it's well over 70% of people will develop cognitive problems during chemotherapy or post-chemotherapy, and this that goes on for an unlimited amount of time. Some people recover a lot quicker than others. But the sort of things that this causes: short-term memory loss and mental fogginess, difficulty with word finding, which is a real problem, you know, in some people facing jobs. So, for example, you know, working in department work and pensions, you know, I'm only taking from examples of people that have maybe gone back to work and where they haven't been as lucky for somebody to come in and do their role for them while they have been off sick. So they return to a great big pile of work on their desk, and nobody's deleted their 4,500 emails. That would be fairly daunting to anybody going back to a workplace, especially if you're having difficulty with all of those things. Visual memory, image and list recall is a real problem. Multitasking. I won't make the obvious joke. But obviously multitasking is a huge problem for people. Learning new skills as well. It's not the time to be maybe going into a brand new job role following chemotherapy. So, you know, we have to be mindful of that as employers, you know, getting somebody back through their phase return and maybe introducing a new job to them straight away. Concentrating on focusing, and obviously this long-term fatigue that I've been talking about, this chronic fatigue. And when I'm talking about fatigue, I'm talking about, you know, going to bed at night, having 8 hours and waking up just as tired or even more tired than when you went to sleep. That's what fatigue is, not to be confused with tiredness. Okay. So the emotional impact is absolutely not to be underestimated. I think the first thing that people tend to say to us when they come through the door, when we actually get them talking because they're maybe so distressed, is that absolute shock and sense of it can't be happening to me. It's surreal. You know, I just went for a routine scan, you know, breast screening, or I just sent that, you know, that poo sample off. You know, anybody over 50 would be receiving those at the moment. The screening program in Nottingham is quite large. I saw a young gentleman. He was had been a previous smoker, but he's seen the adverts on the buses. You may have seen those if you're over a certain age and you've ever been a smoker. Maybe that you'd had a couple of cigarettes down the Irish or wherever you spent your misspent youth. They are calling people that have ever been in that position to come along for a free CT scan. Again, there's no preparation for somebody being told at the age of 52 that they have a lung cancer, and it may or may not be curable. So we have actually seen quite an increased incidence of people coming through from these routine screening. And Nottingham seems to be fairly ahead at the moment with all of the screening coming through. And obviously, the way that we live our lives has had a huge impact on that. You know, people are getting married later, they're having children later. People in their 50s have now got, you know, they've got small children. Whereas maybe 25, 30 years ago, the children would generally be at uni or be married, or they would be a grandfather or a grandmother. That's not happening so much now. So actually these people are still having mortgage, you know, still have a large mortgage. They still have small children. And the impact is massive, absolutely massive. So obviously everybody thinks they're dying. The minute they're given a diagnosis, even if they're told that it's curative right from the beginning, everybody thinks that they're going to die on Wednesday, next Wednesday. And they're very angry. You know, not everybody is a smoker, is a drinker, is obese, is in a highly stressed job, you know, and everybody typically thinks that only those people get cancer. You know, everybody only thinks that you may only get a head and neck tumor if you're all of those things and you're an alcoholic. That's just not the case. Yes, the majority of people who do are, but actually there's a good 30–40% that just don't fall into that category at all. You know, you may get up every morning and run 5 to 10K and you're down the gym, weight training, but you are still susceptible to cancer, unfortunately. It doesn't discriminate against anyone. I have just recently spoken at a Law Society ball where I took a colleague of mine, a consultant in the NHS, who has supported me since I came over here to Maggie's. And unfortunately, she has now got cancer. And I was very lucky to take her along to the Law Society ball to be able to stand up and talk to them. And she was just an example of all of those people sat in the room, you know, in a professional job, looks after herself. And unfortunately, she was diagnosed with cancer 8 months ago. So sadness, yearning, you start the grieving process the minute you're diagnosed with cancer. And the isolation and loneliness, we're back to the importance of the workplace. You might not see the importance as I see it after talking to lots of people, but we do a lot of socializing at work, even if it is on Zoom. And we're only coming into the office occasionally, but actually you're still meeting up for drinks. I'm hoping you're not doing that on Zoom. And you're still, you know, communicating with your colleagues and hearing about their lives and what they did at the weekend and maybe seeing their dog on the screen or whatever you do in your Zoom calls. But it's very isolating not going to work, and everybody forgets about you very, very quickly. They all say, oh yeah, we'll send Claire some flowers, or we'll give her a ring occasionally, but unfortunately that does taper off very, very quickly. Okay. So constantly juggling emotions. As I said, you know, just unreal shot, totally surreal. It can't be me. Oh, I've led such a healthy lifestyle. Nobody in my family has got cancer. And you just go round and round and round. These don't follow any sort of pattern. And then when you do get to the realization, just that raw fear sets in of what is going to happen. You know, even if you're told you have curative disease, you're constantly catastrophizing everything. The treatment's not going to work. And that's entirely normal to catastrophize, I think, at this point and at every point during your cancer journey. You know, you never thought it was going to happen, and it has happened. So it's not irrational to catastrophize at all. So thinking about getting back to work, we all have these sickness policies at work. Getting back to work will be within that. I always say to people that within these policies, it always says that there is management discretion. It can be discussed with people higher, can be discussed with HR. There is management discretion. And I always say to people at this point, this is your opportunity to be a human being. Okay. You don't have to follow the sickness policy line for line. It is an opportunity to be a kind and compassionate human being at that point. And I always also say that if you are not that kind and compassionate human being, find somebody who is. So I think this demonstrates very well. You come back to work, you're not going to go in a straight line from 0 to hero, okay, in 6 weeks. It's not going to happen. You're going to have sort of like this squiggly line, and you might end up back down to 0 a few times. But the more support that you have within the workplace and the more you're supported, the more likely you are to get to hero. Okay. So it's about, you think, you know, you're maybe a young person, as Nick himself maybe, and you've had a diagnosis of cancer. You're not going to trust your body. You've lost complete trust in your body. And actually, you then have to go forward. You may have had curative treatment. You're living with now this uncertainty that actually, especially if you've had routine screening and it's been picked up, you didn't have any signs or symptoms prior to your diagnosis, and then suddenly they're saying goodbye, there's no evidence of cancer, and you're living with this uncertainty, convinced it's going to come back, because actually you didn't know it was there in the first place, because actually you just had a little vial through your door, you did a little sample, off you went, and then somebody contacted you to say you've got bowel cancer. So dealing with the outside world, which is always difficult, because actually suddenly you come to realise that actually nobody knew you had cancer and you were walking around, and now suddenly everybody you're looking at thinking, well, that person across the street, actually, you know what, they might have a diagnosis of cancer. Because actually when you get diagnosed with cancer, everybody around you seems to have cancer, and everybody is gladly telling you every cancer story on the planet that they know, sharing it with you. So adjusting to the end of treatment is extremely difficult, as you can imagine. So supporting with someone with cancer as an employer, manager and colleague. And let's not forget the importance of a colleague. So we talk about thinking traps and assumptions that may not fit, behaviour traps and communication traps. So thinking about the time frame of physical changes. So you may look fabulous, but it doesn't mean to say that emotionally you're feeling that great. People get positive scan results, they come in here and they're absolutely in floods of tears and they don't understand why they're not on top of the world. They get to the end of their treatment and the nurse says, oh, do you want to ring the bell now? And they're like, no, I don't. No. I don't want to ring the bell. Lots of people get their family and they're all ringing the bell, but I do have to say the majority of people just don't want to go anywhere near that bell. So the bell signifies the end of treatment. But most people say, well, it's not over. It's not over for me at the moment. Please don't fall into the trap of, you know, when your colleague comes back to work 6 months down the line and you introduce something and actually they're struggling to toe the party line or play the corporate game. I'm ever so aware of what that is now. Please don't think that actually they're not coping just because they have a bit of an outburst. We're all entitled to a little bit of an outburst now and again and disagree. But just because they've had a cancer diagnosis doesn't mean to say that it's all down to that. It may be actually they just don't agree with what's being said. So don't assume that anybody, as I said, who looks good actually feels great physically as well. Women are very, very good at getting out of bed in the morning and making themselves look as presentable as they possibly can. I'm not saying that men don't do that, but women have a little bit more of a helping hand in terms of heated rollers and a bit of makeup. Okay, men don't have that, don't have those sorts of things, but I think women tend to think that actually if they put their face on and they make their hair look nice and they dress nicely, then it's going to make them feel better. But actually they might be feeling absolutely rubbish. And don't assume that anybody with a life-limiting illness, that work becomes less important. I have lots of people that come into the centre that are working, and I can think of one particular gentleman who is in his late 30s, who is dying, metastatic melanoma, possibly has only 3 to 4 months. He's like the most amazing person on the planet, and he is continuing to work. And he's doing that because he chooses to do it, and his employers are absolutely off the scale amazing. What do they get from that? He's a hugely experienced guy with lots of information and knowledge, and the company wants to continue to use him. And they're very sensible in doing that, because actually 80% of the time he's functioning completely normally. You know, there's nothing wrong with his brain. The only days that he struggles is the days that he's having treatment and the day after. And he is choosing to carry on. And sometimes he sits in the centre and works because actually he wants to come and see the clinical psychologist, or he just wants to spend a bit of time with us. So increasing time is smooth increase in functioning. We just looked at the previous diagram. That isn't always the case. Don't fall into that trap. Behaviour traps. I think this is very important for colleagues as well as an employer. Please don't avoid tricky conversations for fear of upsetting, or saying, I don't want to talk about it because I don't want to keep reminding them. It's always going to be there. They're not going to forget they've got cancer. Saying nothing is worse than saying anything at all, even if it is the wrong thing. Try to avoid being, in a paternalistic role. That's not the role of an employer or a colleague. Most people don't want to be left in peace. Don't overplan for their return, but don't underplan as well. Okay, you're not in a position to advise them. Okay. And falsely reassuring. If they've gone off on sick pay and they were in a secondment, you do have to make it very clear that that secondment may not be available and they may be going back to their old job. Honesty is absolutely the best policy. And we put this in here, sharing information without consent. And so then that tends to lead to people not even bothering to ask for consent. Most people that we speak to that have a diagnosis of cancer, they want all their colleagues to know, because they want the support. It's not a secret. It's not a secret for the employer to keep. A quick email out or a quick mention in the team meeting. If you've gained consent off that person, always speak to a colleague going off sick. How would you like, how would you like to play this? Would you like everybody to know? You'll probably, realise that actually they've told everybody anyway. And most people do know. And I think communication traps is a really difficult one. Like I say, I think it's always better to say something and then nothing at all. But actually just don't fall into the trap of introducing people to, cancer reducing diets or some crazy place in Germany. Or I'm not saying that all places in Germany are crazy. I'm not saying that. I'm just, that's just an example. Or saying, if you remortgage your house, then you're doing this new trial in Lithuania. Absolutely trust me when I say this. They are going to know everything that is available out there, weird, wacky, or anything that is absolutely out of their reach. They will have looked and trawled through the internet for every available thing. They don't need you to tell them about it. They don't need to tell you don't need to tell them that your brother went to King's College and was treated by, they will already know, okay? And their consultant will have already told them probably, or they will have read it somewhere. And a million other people will have also told them. And it's okay to say, let me know if I can do anything to help, but, maybe follow that with a suggestion of how you can actually help. And actually, you have no idea that they're going to see the world differently, okay? Unless you've had an experience of treatment yourself. And then you are best informed to come forward and say some of these things. but not always, because actually you will feel very differently from that person. So we talk about when things don't go so well. And as you can imagine, we hear lots of these stories. Okay. But I will say to anybody coming through when they're diagnosed with cancer that actually they have as much responsibility to their workplace as their employer has responsibility to them. It's really, really important that they talk to their employer about what type of treatment they're going to have, how long that's likely to take. And all consultants will talk to their patient about how long that treatment is likely to take. And now we all know that that treatment can change because everybody's an individual, and sometimes you start treatment, it might not work for whatever reason, or you may have side effects and they may need to change your treatment. But it's really important for the communication to be two-way. And I think if you get there right, you get in there right at the beginning as an employer, you can absolutely set out your stall, get your ducks in a row, whatever you want to say, and actually have that ongoing conversation with them. And that will immediately cut out that fear and awkwardness, not knowing the right thing to do. If you know that person well enough, you know, you are going to be able to tailor that support and that care to them as an individual. Don't ever treat everybody the same, because it's not going to work. And as mentioned before, that line manager lottery, it's a huge, huge problem. Okay. If you are not good at dealing with these things, then find somebody who is. I know that's difficult in a team of 5 where you may be you're the only manager, but actually you can still bring in a kind colleague with you. There's nothing in the rule books to say you can't do that. Okay. So like we said, doesn't always have to be a line manager. Okay. Let the employee take the lead, but make sure that you prepare really well for the meeting. You know, there'll be questions you want to ask, and you can ask you can ask most things if you know that person well enough, if you've got in there at the beginning, if you've taken an interest in what's going on. This is all about communication skills. It's not about what's been written on a sickness policy. If you don't know them at all, then obviously it's not okay to keep prying, but find somebody who does know them really well. And most people will want to tell you what's going on. And remember that they're not going to remember most of what's been said in that meeting as well, if they're in a distressed state. So think about the timing of that meeting, where you're going to hold it. It may be that actually it's better to go to their house so that they're on home ground and they feel more comfortable and they feel safer. It actually might not be okay for them to come into the office if you're right in the middle of the city centre, and they're poorly. That maybe not be an option for them. So just try and be as flexible as you can. We always say that when people go to see a consultant, their first consultation and maybe even their second, that they only actually retain 9% of the information that's given to them. And 35% of all other information, they actually come away and they interpret it completely incorrectly. And then the rest they don't hear at all. So just be mindful that when you're having difficult conversations, they're not going to be retaining an awful lot of that. So it's really important to minute that and make sure that that you post them a copy or you email them a copy of that information. Okay. Don't make any assumptions when you're talking. Make sure that you're gathering all your information as you go along. And if you're going in blind because you've taken over from somebody else, which we know happens a lot, make sure you've read something about them before you go into the meeting. Otherwise, you're going to end up getting a very non-compliant person in there. And think about your non-verbal. Think about your non-verbal cues. I don't talk about verbal cues a lot because actually, you know, if you're not able to give eye contact, okay, then you're onto an absolute non-starter, really. If you can not have a desk between you, that'd be great. Okay, but I know that's not always possible. Maybe finding the right environment without a phone, and informing your other colleagues that actually, you know, you're not going to be available would be a good place to start. I hear terrible things about, you know, trying to have a conversation and the phone's going, and yeah, it's not great. Okay, so when you're talking to somebody, constantly be what we call chunking and checking, you know, repeating back, reflecting back to them, praising what they're saying to you. And you may find they're doing the same to you. You know, it just encourages a good way, two-way communication. There's lots of information out there about getting back to work, supporting people. ACAS have some really good things, you know, the Disability Act, they outline, you know, quite a few things about cancer diagnosis in their notes as well. So there are a lot of things available to everybody. And I know that you're not going to use any of these things. The most important thing is that you know where to find them if you need them. Always plan when you're going to see that person again or speak to that person. It may be that actually you say to them, you know, how would you like this ongoing communication? How would you like this to take place? Would you like me to give you a ring? Is that too intrusive? Would you like, you know, Claire in the office to give you a ring and find out, give us an update on how you are feeling? If you don't want us to contact you because you are unwell, I would be really grateful if you just let us know, or your husband or your wife or whoever would just let us know. And make it easy for them to keep in touch with you. Don't set down hard and fast rules about ways that it has to be communicated. It doesn't have to be communicated in any way. It can be between you and that employee. And as always, if you haven't documented it, it hasn't happened. So make sure that you document that you've kept in touch with them. And actually that will be a prompter for you, because the weeks go by very, very quickly. And then suddenly you think, oh God, I haven't spoken to Tony for 8 weeks. That's not okay. Because Tony's probably not going to get in touch with you because he can't believe you've not bothered to get in touch with him. And please make sure that HR whoever you know, sorts out the salaries, that they get a clear indication of when full pay finishes, when half pay starts, how much annual leave they can take, all of those really important things that they absolutely need to know for maybe claiming ongoing benefits. Okay. And remember that actually all policies that are written in the workplace are open to change. Okay, they are, you know, you can, they should be reviewed every year to 2 years, or if anything changes. Okay, and when I'm talking about or if anything changes, you may have actually seen somebody in your workplace and you've may read the policy and you thought, well, actually that doesn't work. That doesn't work. That needs a bit of a footnote. I could put a little bit of a guidance in there for further colleagues to read. You know, all of these things are up for change. You know, like I said, everything is not hard, you know, it's not hard and fast. It's not, nothing is, sickness policies are not written in stone. They absolutely can be changed by whoever sits on your policy change board or whatever you call it. But obviously, you know, things change. Cancer as a disease has radically changed in the last 10 years. Like I said, it's now been classified as a chronic illness. And people are not dying from diagnosis. I mean, some are, but typically not dying within 6 to 12 months from diagnosis anymore. You know, they are we are managing to hold that off very successfully with all of these advancement in treatments. But that doesn't mean to say that they're having a good quality of life. So it's just really important to be treating everybody as an individual and listening to what people are saying and getting advice maybe off your colleagues that have dealt with similar situations. And remember that actually they're probably having a really rubbish time. And so I always say, you know, when you're having your nights out, your drinks and, you know, a meal out, please invite them, okay? Just because they're off sick doesn't mean to say that they can't enjoy themselves. And they may say, yeah, I can't make it on this occasion, but actually they will have been really touched that you bothered to ask, that you actually even remembered them. And actually the next time you go out, they may be on a having a good week, and they may not be feeling so poorly. They may have moved to the next bit of their treatment, and they may really love to come out with you. But it is just giving them permission to say, actually, we know that you're having treatment, but actually, if you want to come out, then you can still do that as well, and nobody's going to judge you. You know, because people do think, actually, because I'm off sick, well, I can't go out because actually that's going to look really bad, because they're going to think, well, she's managed to come out for a meal, so, well, what's to stop her coming into work? Okay, I'm really sorry I've sped through that because I was really conscious that you've got half an hour as well, Nick.
No, that's no problem at all, Annie. Thank you so much. And it's an incredible insight into how cancer affects the individual, and it gives us a lot to think about, I think, from an employer's perspective. We will have a bit of time for questions at the end, so Annie, do hang on there.
Okay.
And I'll whiz through my section. So what we thought it might be helpful to do is just highlight a few of the legal bits that relate to this area, and look at a few case studies, actual tribunal cases where cancer has been a feature, and how employers perhaps haven't dealt with it particularly well, and we can take some learnings from that as we go. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Nick, and I head the employment team at Actons. We work with employers in the main with this kind of issue and a whole wide range of other things, mainly for SMEs across the East Midlands, but also for some household names, some of which are on that slide. I have a wonderful team who are all there, but let's look at the kind of the first proper slide as part of the session. Cancer is an automatic disability under the Equality Act. So often when it comes to medical conditions, one of the first things we're looking at from a legal perspective is, does this condition meet the definition of disabled in the Equality Act? Does it have a long-term substantial impact on day-to-day activities? Actually, the legislation is very clear that cancer is just automatically covered by the Equality Act. So we're automatically into that zone in terms of managing that and being aware of the potential risks. There are discrimination risks, therefore, as a result of disability, and they can take a number of different forms, and some of the kind of labels for those are in that second bullet point. But I think probably the best way of describing or explaining those is to look at the case studies in more detail. But essentially, it may well be, unfortunately, either some people are directly discriminated against because of their disability, because of their cancer. That tends to be rarer these days, because it's essentially, I'm treating you less favourably, or I'm dismissing you, or whatever it might be, because of your cancer. And it's not usually quite as overt as that, although Annie may have some stories where that is the case. It tends to be where we're applying policies or procedures, again, as Annie had described, that disadvantage people who are suffering with cancer, and again we'll look at that in the cases, or it's as a result of long-term absence, and that's something that arises from the cancer, and that's another label that we can put on the discrimination. The other thing that obviously comes into play is considering making reasonable adjustments. And again, lots of the stuff that we've covered so far is about doing that well, and adjusting things like sick pay, time off, phased returns, offering part-time working, and those kind of things. And again, as the case studies will show, employment tribunals, I think, have always expected employers to take that approach where people, qualify as disabled. But I think increasingly so are expecting employers to make quite significant changes to the way that they manage situations, in order to avoid, people with cancer and other disabilities being disadvantaged in certain situations. And I think there's a real push within the tribunal system with judges looking at that to ensure that that's done well, and often to a sort of surprising extent, even where in the past it might not have been picked up on. Tribunals are pushing for that kind of thing more often. Interestingly, the practical side that we see with the cases that we deal with, communication, as Annie has said, is just so important. We see legal issues, legal risk coming about and escalating as a result of employers not communicating well with people who are unwell. And I would certainly reinforce the message that talking to people about what's going on, how they are, and what can be done to support them in an open and honest way is super important. And too many of the cases that we see have been managed badly because communication has been poor, and the right conversations have not been had at the right time. And then things get very adversarial and relationships break down, and we end up with tribunal claims and that kind of thing. So super important to remember that. The other side that we often see is consistency, and and this is kind of a double-edged sword, or there's two sides to it, I suppose. So consistency in terms of not treating people differently, in the sense that if you have somebody who is off sick as a result of cancer and gets sick pay, but then you have somebody else who's off sick as a result of cancer who doesn't get sick pay, or that discretionary side, clearly that difference in treatment can cause issues with the employee. So ensuring that there's a degree of consistency there. But as Annie said, everybody's journey with cancer will be different, and what they need will likely be different, and therefore not treating everybody the same at the same time is clearly important too. But I think having an idea of, okay, well, how do we approach long-term sickness in terms of sick pay and time off, and what's our policy on that, and do our managers who are managing these processes understand how that works, is really, really important. And again, we're seeing an increase in people having something in place that helps managers in terms of guidance for managing those kind of situations, which I think is helpful. Again, we also always highlight the impact on colleagues as well, particularly with very serious diagnoses, managing the rest of the team well in terms of the impact on them, and equipping them to deal with that situation well is important. And our HR colleagues often focus on that side of things too. And the other side that we see quite often is the people who are employed by us but caring for people who are suffering with cancer. Clearly, the impact, as Annie set out, on somebody in terms of treatment and the effect of that is very severe often. And actually, somebody who's both working and a carer for someone going through that treatment will have a lot to deal with, and giving support and flexibility there is important. In part because actually there's legal risk for employers in not doing so too, from an associative discrimination risk. So actually people who are family members caring for others who have a disability, in theory, could bring a claim against you as their employer for a lack of sort of flexibility and support in that area as a result of the other person's disability. So that's one that often is missed, but again is important. So in terms of the cases, there's just three tribunal cases that I wanted to talk you through. I think they're good examples of the kinds of things that the tribunals are grappling with in this area. And the first was a Mr. Curtin. He worked at a company who supplied car care products. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and his treatment involved surgery, and that resulted in incontinence. Now, the tribunal basically had to grapple with whether he was disabled or not. So that might sound a bit strange, given that I said that cancer was immediately a disability at the beginning of the session. But actually, what was being argued by his employer here was that his incontinence was as a result of surgery, not as a result of cancer. Now, again, you can draw your own conclusions as to your views on that particular employer, but essentially that's the line that they were taking, and that they were arguing therefore that his disability discrimination claim should fail on the basis that he wasn't disabled, because it wasn't an automatic disability, because this issue that he was experiencing wasn't as a result of the cancer. And I suppose unsurprisingly, although it went up a number of stages within the tribunal process to quite a high level, they found that the impairment was as a result of the cancer, and not just that artificial distinction that the employer was taking, and that it was the surgery itself, and therefore they found that he was disabled, and that his claim should be sent back to the original employment tribunal to be reconsidered. So again, I suppose it just highlights that and reinforces Annie's point that there have been and are employers who are managing these kind of processes badly, and not only that, then pursuing defences to claims that I suspect most of us would think are pretty unreasonable, and would hope not to be in that situation. A more recent case was Mrs. Healy in Lancashire County Council. So she was employed as an early years specialist at the council in their schools improvement service, had 2 occurrences of cancer in 2014 and 2017, and was off sick for much of 2018. And then this seems to be quite a common occurrence. There was a restructure of the team, which impacted on Mrs. Healy and her role. And essentially it resulted in her having to interview for a new role, as the employer described it, which was essentially the same role as she'd been doing before. And it was interesting, as we heard, the impact of the symptoms and the treatment earlier on. It reinforced to me why the tribunal may well have found what they did in this situation. But essentially, they found that the employer had failed to make reasonable adjustments and had discriminated against Mrs. Healy on the basis that they'd made her interview for a role that was essentially the same role. They hadn't made any adjustments to the process, and given those cognitive impacts that we heard about earlier on, you can well understand why, if she was still experiencing the effects of chemotherapy, for example, that may well have impacted on the ability to take part in that process anyway. The other reason that I highlighted this particular case was that the tribunal award was £800,000, and I don't believe that she was on a particularly high salary, but the tribunal found that the discrimination was so serious that they awarded loss of earnings for salary, they awarded injury to feelings as a result of the discrimination, they awarded, I think, pension loss for a period of time moving forward, and they also, unusually for an employment tribunal, awarded aggravated damages, which suggests that they found that the employer had almost deliberately, it's verging on deliberately, got this wrong and treated her really very badly. So not a great example of an employer getting it right, but again, highlights the potential risk of getting it wrong, in this kind of situation. And then finally, a slightly older case, but again, another one where the employer has perhaps run an argument that many of us would prefer them not to have done. But Mrs. Lofty was a cafe assistant and developed a blemish on her cheek. It was diagnosed as a precancerous lesion or in situ cancer, and she was eventually dismissed following some absence from work, which had actually included some time off for her treatment. Unsurprisingly, she brought claims for unfair dismissal and disability discrimination. And again, the employer strangely sought to argue that actually she didn't have cancer because it was described as sort of precancerous cells. And again, it's not, I'm not an expert in that particular area, but it seems like, again, they were grasping at straws in terms of trying to defend the claim by arguing that, the individual couldn't bring a disability discrimination claim. And I think at the time, the tribunal were presented with some medical evidence that it was a precancerous lesion that could lead to skin cancer, and even the Cancer Research website, perhaps included some unhelpful text in that particular case. However, the tribunal did find that the Equality Act, the disability discrimination legislation, doesn't distinguish between different degrees of cancer. So if there's any cancerous cells, then that is sufficient, to meet that definition and for that person to be classed as disabled under the Act. So again, was successful in that claim. I'm conscious of time for questions, because I'm sure people will want to fire some Annie's way at the very least. So I'm going to skip over that final case and see if anybody has any questions for us, either in the chat or if it's possible to unmute and you fancy doing that. It's not too scary. There's not too many people on the call. Feel free to ask away for either me or Annie. Yeah, we've got a hand up. Paula.
I just wondered if there was any case law, because the cancer is an automatic disability. I was just wondering what the case law says about how long after that cancer there is that protection. Is it during treatment? Because I myself, I've had cancer many years ago, but at what point does it become no longer relevant?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I haven't seen anything specifically on that in terms of cases. I think the usual situation with a disability, not necessarily cancer, because it's defined as automatically so. Usually it would be a case of the condition lasting at least 12 months or being likely to last 12 months. And my guess is, based on what Annie has said, there's a fair chance that cancer would be present in some form or likely to recur for an extended period of time. So I suspect it would be unlikely that I would be ever advising an employer to say, oh, okay, well, I think you're in the clear now in terms of how you deal with this employee because they've been given an all clear. I think in reality, the way that I tend to approach those kind of cases where there's a disability risk is that you're probably going to treat the person in a very similar way, regardless of whether they meet the definition or not anyway, because generally speaking, it's about supporting them back into work if they're off sick, or making adjustments that will help them improve what they're doing day to day for you as an employer. So you should, of course, be mindful of the risk that there might be a disability in the background. But actually, even if they weren't disabled and the definition no longer applied, if they're off sick or they're underperforming or whatever it might be, we're still going to need to manage that well in any event. But no, I haven't seen anything specific on if you are clear of cancer, does that mean, you know, it changes the position? But I would imagine if there was an issue, it would be assessed again at the point that person had, you know, any kind of illness or time off.
And it would be very much dependent on the level of late effects that they were experiencing. So, for example, some of the things I was talking about, the head and neck cancers, where they have intensive radiotherapy and they have neck dissections, you know, those late effects are never going to go. You know, some people never eat and drink again in their life. Some people have got, you know, lack of, you know, saliva, they can't swallow, they can't turn their neck. Those are ongoing problems, and a lot of those people that I see are back at work, but still are heavily involved with the late effects team and their consultants. So they would be, even though they have no evidence of a cancer diagnosis, they're still being treated for the late effects. So they will have protection.
Yeah.
I should imagine, well, I know that they will have protection for as long as they have those late effects, which will be forever.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah,
sure
I mean,
that's
in my
right.
case, you're talking about a couple of decades, but I still have lung damage from the radiotherapy, you know, so when I get a cough, it just goes on and on and on, you know, so it's an interesting, because obviously my employer wouldn't have any knowledge of any of that, so it's interesting. Thank you.
No problem. Anybody else?
I think I've got a quick question, if that's okay. So you hear lots of horror stories about employers doing all the wrong things and, you know, not necessarily dealing with the situation particularly well. But I'd love to hear if you've got any examples of anyone that's gone absolutely over and above, because as an employer, we do try and do the right thing and always try and go over and above. I kind of would like some inspiration of someone going over and above, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Annie, you mentioned an employer earlier on with the
Yes.
30-year-old guy. That sounded pretty good. Have you got examples from the people that you've spoken to?
Yeah, he works in IT. It's a really big firm in Nottingham. I have to give probably a little bit of a shout out to Capital One. We see quite a few of their employees, a lot of their employees actually coming through who have had excellent support. Yeah, I think maybe Eon is another one. I'm only naming companies that I've had experience of and people have spoken really highly about. Few of the primary schools in Nottingham had some really good support, and a few of the biggest senior schools supporting carers. I've got one chap who is head of a subject lead. His wife is sadly not very well, having secondary breast cancer, really coming to the end, and they have allowed him to go back on an ad hoc basis managing his team and have kept him as head of service. So really, really good support there. Yeah, I hear a lot of really good stories, you know, but sadly, you always remember the worst. You always remember the worst. You know, I want to share maybe a couple with you. I had a lady come in yesterday, early years again, teaching. So she was never going to get sick pay anyway. Employer has now learned that it would cost the employer £7 a month to keep her on the books. But actually 2 weeks after she was diagnosed with cancer, she received a letter through the post from her employer saying that due to her ongoing medical condition, they would no longer be able to continue with her employment. Effectively, they just sacked her.
Yeah.
Very foolishly. Well, not foolishly that she came to us, but spoke to our benefits advisor, who said, "Oh no, you need to go back." But actually, the husband had already contacted a solicitor at that point. She will pay dearly for that. That's a big mistake, you know. And especially as actually all the evidence is in a letter, you know. I've got another young chap in his early 40s. He's got a secondary prostate cancer, but doing really well on treatment, but he's on ongoing treatment. He has not stopped working all through his treatment. He's got 2 small children. His wife is a professional, and he works for a very large company in Nottingham. They should absolutely know better in the health industry, private company. And he actually requested, because of the amount of pelvic radiotherapy he's had, he does a lot of driving. He's a sort of a bit of a director job, and said that he needs to do less driving because of the pain. They actually got this gentleman to, and I've been slightly involved in his claim. They actually got this gentleman to train up somebody else to do his job that he was doing on the road. And then they restructured the team and they made him redundant and changed the role name for this other chap who was essentially doing exactly the same role.
Yeah. And Annie, in terms of the positive stuff that you've seen, because I think that it's useful for us to be reminded that actually employers are not getting this right a lot of the time. Yeah. Presumably that's along the lines of the sort of things that you've been talking about in terms of looking at sick pay and the length of time, being generous with that. It's about, managers having good conversations in a supportive way,
absolutely,
and communicating in those, kind of ways. But I agree with you that the challenge there is often the manager lottery, isn't it? As we all know, as HR professionals, it depends who's actually line managing the person and how that comes about, doesn't it?
And actually, so you can't really generalize, with companies. I say that I've heard some amazing stories from Capital One. I have heard one that wasn't so positive, and that is an absolute line manager lottery. But I've had a few phone calls from, for example, like IKEA, where I've had a manager ring me up and ask what they can do, how can they help there, because they had no experience of it. And so they have reached out independently to ask somebody, and it was actually they had contacted a consultant through a friend who actually then referred them to me. So we do see some really, really good examples. And I want to say that the bigger companies absolutely should be better, and we hear better things about them, but I can't generalize like that. Some really small teams are absolutely brilliant at managing, and they're going to be struggling the most because actually they have to cover that person. But I think it's for the companies who do it well, they're thinking about the long-term impact that will have, with the team losing that amount of expertise. So they think actually, 12 months out, the time it's going to take to retrain, and have somebody of that experience and that expertise within the team is going to be really hard to replace. So yeah, I sometimes it's just sensible and common sense. It's nothing to do with having a good policy. It really is. I've spoken to lots of employers that have a diagnosis of cancer themselves, and we get onto the subject about how people are treated in their workplaces. And it is very often just that sensible person, and they're a little bit compassionate, but I do hear some really good stories. But do I hear more? Has it changed in the 5 years that I've been here? Because obviously I never encountered this. I was working in acute oncology. I sort of got them in, patched them up, and off they went. It's not changed at all. So have we got better at it for those companies that are poor? No, I don't think we have. Not in my experience. I think the good ones are still doing a brilliant job. And then we have these pockets of absolute disasters where, when I think about it, I think, why would you do that? Surely, I see it across the, splashed across the Daily Mail. Somebody's discriminated against. I mean, is it a moment of madness that they think it's all right to dismiss somebody and then put it in writing? You think, oh, that's crucifying yourself, isn't it? Once you put it in writing, you say, well, I'm really sorry, but due to your medical health condition, we're going to have to terminate your employment. I just wonder, do they talk to another person before they make those decisions?
Well, certainly after 2 weeks. Yeah, you're asking for trouble. So there's some good input in the chat. as well. Just picking up on that. So if you've got access to that, then that's great. So Alison's saying we currently have an employee who's diagnosed with terminal cancer, have made adjustments to cope with a wheelchair, time off for treatment, also massive impact on her colleagues. We unfortunately have had multiple employees with cancer, and they are paid full pay until they have died and remain employed so that their families can benefit from the death in service policy. And then Nicola also says, we're currently working with a manager who's supporting his mother and swapping shifts. So this is a carer, I think, of somebody who's suffering with cancer. Yeah. And also has paid time off if a shift swap isn't possible. We talk a lot and ask what we can do and what would help. Macmillan also have a great toolkit for employers, which our managers have used. So that's really interesting. Thank you, guys. So I think Carol's asked any guidance or advice for employers managing time off for carers or close family for members of cancer patients. So I guess from my side, April this year, new carers leave was introduced, and that's, I think, a week's unpaid leave that employers are required to give in those sort of circumstances, to either give care or arrange for care for a dependent. Although that's clearly not amazing given it's a week off with no money. But it has been introduced. But yeah, I think it's another one where flexibility is and good communication is going to be so important in terms of understanding what's going on for that person who's caring, isn't it?
Yeah, and remembering that people in that position, if actually they are having to require nearly full-time care, obviously, and it's getting really difficult for them to hold down a job, it's just making everybody aware of what they can claim. Carers allowance, personal independence payment for the person they're caring for, which all allow somebody to be cared for. But lots of people don't actually realise that those are not means tested. They are not means tested benefits, so they come automatically, regardless of how much you're earning, how much money you have in the bank, etc.
Yeah. The other one, I think, that probably hasn't been mentioned, but I see some times come up, is a permanent health insurance policy that some employers will operate. Obviously, there's a cost to that, but for people who are very, very unwell, it then provides via that insurance policy, usually a percentage of salary for a period of time, often for a very long time. So again, a number of employers that I know who are, I suppose, towards that compassionate end of the spectrum, will often operate a scheme like that. And I guess the key there is managing it well so that the people who really do need it are on that scheme. Maria, I think, has a hand up.
Yeah, so this has been incredibly helpful, by the way. So unfortunately in our organisation we have had a number of cases of cancer. In fact, it feels like quite a lot, to be fair, in the last year or so. They've all been very diverse, as you said, Annie, in terms of the diagnoses, but then in terms of how people have responded and the treatments and everything that they're going through. So we do have an absence policy. We have been very flexible with that policy to meet the needs of each individual. But now what we're looking at is potentially creating a separate policy specific to how we manage cancer in the workplace. And then also, very importantly, is some education of managers and supervisors in terms of how to manage that as well, because it's difficult for them sometimes as well. It's not just when you become a manager or supervisor, it's not an automatic thing that you're given or that you're comfortable with. So I'm just curious, from both your perspective, Annie, and Nick, for organisations you've worked with where you have seen that good practice, do they typically have a separate policy or guidelines for managers on managing cancer in the workplace?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm certainly going to ask. I'm going to John Lewis in a couple of weeks, actually. They've asked if they can have a talk for their managers. So I will ask them that question, and I will get back to Nick on that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I will start asking that question. Yeah, I know the NHS don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I see a mixed picture. I suppose probably less employers with a separate policy for cancer, but there are some because it is so common. So and I think managers, find it particularly difficult because there's a fear around it often. I think in terms of asking questions and managing someone who is suffering with cancer. So yes, they certainly do exist. I'm not sure there's necessarily a link between that and an employer doing it brilliantly, because clearly it's possible to do it well without a policy. But I think it can't really. I can't see that it would do any harm, to have one in place where people are clear on how best to manage these situations, and whatever guidance and support is available has got to be helpful, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I don't want a policy that's going to be overly restrictive, right? I don't want to introduce restrictions on this because each case is so different.
Absolutely.
But the other risk of not having something is that you're inconsistent in how you deal with each situation. And if you're not careful, you get a personality thing come into it as well. So this person seems more worthy than this person in terms of how we deal with it. Right. And that happens, and you see it much more so perhaps in smaller organizations as well. So it's more around having consistency in the approach in how we deal with these situations, not necessarily tying ourselves down to exactly how we would deal with payment of people, for instance, and that type of thing. It's been a very different experience with an employee who's been diagnosed with terminal cancer, who's actually very young. So he's only in his late 40s. He's got a young family. That kind of diagnosis is entirely different to somebody who's had thankfully treatable cancer that they're recovering from really well. But you still need to be somehow keeping some kind of consistency in terms of how you initially deal with those situations. And that's why I'm thinking of probably more guidelines than a policy, to be honest, to give people the confidence of knowing how to initially deal with a situation like that.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Maria.
Or certainly that sharing, that sharing for people who have supported somebody in that workplace. As I was saying, there's no harm going into, the policies and adding footnotes, Yeah,
that's another way of doing it. Yeah, thank you.
Fab. And that takes us to 1 minute. In fact, the clock's just changed to the final minute of the session. So I'm just going to hand very quickly to Bjorn, just to close.
Hi everyone, I'll be really quick. I'm Bjorn from Blue Source Recruitment, so one of the founders of the network along with Nick. 3 things I just wanted to cover quickly. So one, massive thank you to you, Annie. So some of those statistics were really eye-opening. 3 to 3.5 million people, with cancer in the UK was a real eye-opener. And I think all of us have been sort of touched by cancer in some way, directly or indirectly. So I wish I'd known about 1 or 2 of those sort of communication traps that you talked about. So that was really insightful. Thank you very much. Thank you to Nick for the insight that he gave from a legal perspective and how handling those cases badly can work out. And then thanks to everyone who attended. So we are organising future events as we speak. So the next event is likely to be on the menopause, which is going to be hosted at Boots head office, which will be an in-person event. So keep an eye open for that. That should be happening in June, as well as the sort of roundtable events that we do. So thank you very much. If anyone's interested in hosting a future event, please get in touch. And any feedback from today would be really appreciated. So hope you all found it insightful.
Brilliant. Thanks, Bjorn, and thanks everybody for joining us.